Well, during the last 15 years, which is to say the period since the Howard Costello era, governments of both Labor and coalition persuasions have settled into what our friends at the Financial Review editorial page have called the complacency of prosperity. And during this period, Canberra rested on the windfall of the China-fueled resources boom and at the same time failed to cut runaway spending programs, most notably the NDIS, Gonski schools, aged care, childcare, public hospitals. Even the Liberal governments of Prime Ministers Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison embraced the political left's economic credentials as big spenders. Borrowing was at astronomical levels, incentive-sharpening reforms in tax and industrial relations to drive productivity had been shelved, and a debt-funded modern entitlement culture had taken hold. The result has been a productivity slowdown, wage stagnation, and a national debt in the range of $1.2 trillion. Now, Australians have become relatively used to these good economic times, but in many respects, those days are over. After a decade of quantitative easing and in response to the COVID pandemic, massive fiscal stimulus, Canberra's conventional policies have been exhausted. With the Ukraine crisis, the global supply chain disruption, the global energy shock, fears of stagflation, so high inflation and high unemployment, the likes of which we've not seen since the 1970s, and of course the more dangerous global outlook, particularly with the rise of a more assertive China. With all of that, we have entered a new and dangerous environment. And although Australia's starting point appears better than much of the rest of the world, after all, inflation and unemployment are a lot lower here compared to the rest of the world, our nation is hardly immune to any global economic storm. This means that there will come a day when our political leaders and policymakers need to exercise spending restraint and put in place productivity-enhancing reforms to grow the economy and help pay down the COVID pandemic debt. So, what now? What should define Australian economic policy in coming decades? Well, Angus Taylor is the shadow federal treasurer. Before that, he was, and among other portfolios, the federal energy minister. And before his election to Parliament in 2013, he was a leading figure in management consulting, most notably at McKinsey's. Angus graduated in economics law at the University of Sydney, where he won the University Medal, and he was a Rhodes Scholar in philosophy at Oxford University. And with that, please welcome Angus Taylor. Thanks, mate. Have fun.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you to you and the CIS for putting this on. It's really wonderful to be here at the CIS. I've followed your work for many years, and I think it's an important contribution to thought leadership here in Australia. We need that thought leadership, and I think the CIS's role in that has been enormously important. Of course, the CIS has been fond of pointing out in recent years, as you just did, Tom, that this has been a tough time over recent years for fiscal conservatives. And my side of politics has long believed that a strong economy demands lower tax rates, balanced budgets, spending growth restraint, and containment of inflation and interest rates. And there's no greater killer of aspiration, of enterprise, personal responsibility than permanently higher taxing spending governments, crowding out individual and business activity. So nothing could have prepared us, and I'm sure many in this room as well, for the onslaught of global spending made necessary by the strong and often lengthy COVID restrictions. But despite the measures taken during the pandemic, the strength of the recovery here in Australia has been absolutely striking, to say the least, and Tom referred to some of that. The economy Labor has inherited as the government is extraordinarily strong. And I'll also demonstrate today how the coalition left a remarkably robust budget position. This is entirely at odds with the grim narrative of the Treasurer, who's only too happy at the moment to talk down the economy and the budget. But it's true that the economic and political context we're facing right now is changing rapidly, again, as Tom referred to in his introduction. As rapidly as I can remember for a long, long time, as we emerge from the pandemic. We also emerge from the election, of course, and we're seeing these very sharp increases in inflation and interest rates. So it's timely, I think, to look at these new challenges through the traditional lens of Liberal and National Party values. For the coalition, this is not a time, I think, to talk about whether we should move to the left or the right. It's not a battle between moderates and conservatives. It's a reassertion of what we believe as Liberals and Nationals. I think the real battle here, the real contest here is between our core beliefs and those of our political competitors. A belief that the private sector drives opportunity and prosperity, not government. A belief that dynamic, resilient small businesses are the backbone of a strong economy, not bureaucracies. A belief that hard-working families know what is best for them, not public servants or politicians. And a belief that the vision of each Australian, individually, should be the vision of our nation, not a vision conjured up at a conference in Canberra. A belief that big business has a crucial role to play, providing competitive goods and services to their customers, who are, after all, hard-working Australian households and businesses. Now, in recent decades, a consensus emerged, which only some dared to challenge, including people here at the CIS, that economic shocks could always be fixed with more government stimulus, more government spending. But you can't just throw money at rising inflation and interest rates hoping to solve the problem. Moreover, Australians' demands for high-quality public services will need to be met, but can't just be met by throwing more money at the services. Now, many will remember here the philosophies of Thatcher and Reagan emerged the last time we faced the kind of environment we are facing today. They recognised, and voters recognised, that centre-right values offered solutions to the problems their countries faced. Now, many will say that the situation we face now is not as dire as back then. But even if inflation hasn't reached the giddy heights of the 70s and 80s, and it certainly hasn't yet, the fastest way to get there is to deny the problem and adopt the wrong solutions. So this morning I'll argue it's time to refocus on four imperatives, which together form a back-to-basics economic agenda. First, containing inflation and interest rates. Second, balancing the budget and reducing debt. Third, reducing taxes to empower aspiration and enterprise. And fourth, reasserting the role of productivity to drive economic growth and strong real wages. On the back of these imperatives, I'll outline the tests that we see for Labor in the upcoming budget. So let me start with containing inflation and interest rates. Despite the great strength of the economy, and perhaps because of it, nothing is set to cause more pain for many Australian households and businesses than rising inflation and interest rates. Interest rates hit borrowers on flexible mortgages, and those costs are escalating fast. A typical New South Wales mortgage holder of $750,000 will be paying $900 a month more compared with the beginning of the year, $900 a month. The recent cash rate increases are being passed through with about a 2 to 3 month lag. So by Christmas this year, the impact of the cash rate changes will be 4 times what consumers had been experiencing. Now, it's the natural instinct of Liberals and Nationals to want to contain interest rates and inflation because these are insidious taxes on hard-working Australians and on their savings. Inflation raises income taxes through bracket creep, of course, amongst other things, but it also confuses consumers and saps the incentive to have a crack, to have a go. Until recently, some commentators and economists were arguing that a bit of inflation would be a good thing. But what we're seeing now is not a bit, it's a lot. We've seen this before, as I said earlier, in the 70s, when ultimately governments and central banks lost control and the pain was extreme. I was 9 in late 1975, and alongside the dismissal, inflation and rising interest rates was the biggest topic around. Growing up on a farm, my dad, a farmer, explained in agricultural terms Inflation is more money with the same number of cows. The price of a cow goes up along with the price of everything else. And the money in your piggy bank is worth less. I got it straight away and I've never forgotten it. And of course, Malcolm Fraser won the election in December that year in a landslide, and inflationary pains were absolutely central to that victory, and I remember that to this day. Not surprisingly, managing government spending was a central focus in the subsequent years for that government. It was actually an underappreciated strength of that government. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the impact of high interest rates and inflation continued, with farmers and small businesses actively campaigning and rallying for solutions. As the problem intensified, a shift to strong independent central banks gained momentum and played a crucial role in delivering solutions. But the success of those reforms, I think, has created some complacency about expansionary monetary and fiscal policy around the world, particularly amongst progressive governments. Avoiding this complacency is now crucial, and there's 4 parts to that. First, we need to ensure the Reserve Bank is absolutely recommitted to strong inflation targets. It's timely for the RBA review to consider how the bank can improve its forecast, guidance and bond trading strategy. We need to reaffirm the importance of an independent, credible, capable Reserve Bank with an undistracted focus on a 2 to 3% inflation target. While ESG issues excite many, they should never distract a central bank from its central task, its primary role. We won't support new distractions for the RBA outside of that core task, but we will support a back-to-basics agenda. The second opportunity to reduce inflationary pressures is to reduce supply constraints. Australia's job vacancy rate is in uncharted territory, absolutely uncharted territory, approaching 500,000, having barely breached 200,000 before the pandemic. Think about that, 500,000 versus just over 200,000 before the pandemic. Every business person will tell you how challenging the situation is, small or large. The first port of call should be every Australian who wants to work, but is held back by the tax and welfare system. That's why we proposed a doubling of the job bonus for aged pensioners and veterans, allowing them to work more without losing their pensions. It was extremely disappointing that Labor only adopted a half-baked temporary version of this policy. Effective marginal tax rates are way too high for many Australians, and we should be looking to reduce them, encouraging work as a pathway to a better life. Targeted immigration also needs to be part of the answer to fill the remaining gap. Longer-term skills investment's crucial, but it must be effective and responsive to what the market needs. During the pandemic, we provided low or fee-free training in areas with skill shortages such as aged care, and that initiative paid off with 220,000 trade apprentices currently in training, 220,000, the most since 1963. The third imperative is to avoid a price-wage spiral. We all want to see higher real wages. But if there is a race between prices and wages, real wages will lose. We saw that in the 70s and 80s, and we will see it again if Labor gives in to the extreme demands for industry-wide bargaining we're seeing from the union movement right now. If this union push is successful, it will end in tears. Finally, we need to reaffirm the crucial role of fiscal policy on inflation and interest rates. Now, even Keynesian economists have recognised this case for a long time, even if they tend to underestimate the costs. More recently, John Cochrane from the Hoover Institution has shown that sustained deficits can cause ongoing inflation as markets lose faith in the ability of governments to repay debts. These are hardly radical ideas. One of the secrets to Australia's pandemic success was that monetary policy and fiscal policy were aligned. They need to align again. We've heard this plea from central bankers around the world. If governments can't contain spending, then central banks will have to hit the brakes harder. Australia's economy is in a strong position, but there's a serious test in containing interest rates and inflation, which takes me to balanced budgets and debt reduction. Now, inflation-busting fiscal policy means a balanced budget and a pathway to reduce debt. The truth is that in a period of low interest rates and strong economic growth, balanced budgets were less fashionable across the world, despite the fact that we balance the budget here in 2019 in Australia. While we hear a lot less of this today, fashionable theories emerged in recent years that the direct costs of debt and deficit aren't worth worrying about. However, history tells us everything that is wrong with this argument. We know that economies hit speed humps, they require shock absorbers. So where does Australia stand? We handed over an economy and a budget in far better shape than most could have imagined. Economic growth is remarkably robust. Labour markets are seeing unprecedented strength. As I've said, commodity exports are surprising on the upside, as they so often do. They so often do. Our final budget in March drove a fiscal turnaround of over $100 billion, but even that understates the strength of the budget position that Labor has inherited. The government's monthly accounts show that when the coalition left office, Australia had seen a cumulative surplus over the 7 months since November. It was remarkable, a cumulative surplus, budget surplus over the 7 months since November. Now, I'll show that, you'll see this in chart 1, where the underlying cash balance from November to May equals more than $10 billion, and the fiscal balance over $18 billion. And while we don't yet have the June numbers, we'll see them later this week, Labor has told us they expect the June numbers to be strong. Now, it's important to note that Sydney was only released from lockdowns. This is going back into a memory bank many of us don't want to go back to, but we were only released from lockdowns on October 11 and Melbourne on October 21. So from the moment the country opened up, the budget position improved dramatically, with the net operating balance, the fiscal balance and the underlying cash balance, whatever definition you want to use of the budget, all running a cumulative surplus between November and May. It just required getting out of lockdown. So as we emerged from the pandemic, we saw a sharp reduction in health and welfare costs, and the strength of the economy drove a resumption of pre-pandemic tax receipts. Much has been made of high commodity prices and the impact on company tax revenues, but much of the improvement, in fact the majority of the improvement, came from income tax revenues returning as unemployment fell sharply, and you'll see this in the next chart, where the blue area epidemic bottom is the income tax receipts. That's what really moved. That's what really moved. And that's not surprising given the strength of employment that we've seen over that time period. So the biggest threat to the sustainability of the budget isn't commodity prices, but Labor's predisposition to spend. It's also true that the pandemic led to higher gross debt and net debt, and there will be reasonable debates for years to come about the breadth and length of the restrictions that occurred during the pandemic. But again, a sober examination of the facts on debt is really important. When Labor left government in Australia in 2013, MyEFO showed that the gross debt was expected to reach $667 billion next year and keep growing, 23-24. That means that around 60% of the gross debt in that year, as it's forecast at the moment, was from Labor's time in government. That debt was Labor's, but we took responsibility in government for bringing it down, managing costs as good governments must. Since 2013, we extended the maturity of the debt from 5.2 years to 7.2 years, locking in low rates. For instance, the average yield of Treasury bonds issued through the pandemic was only 1%. As interest rates have risen in recent months, this long-dated, low-cost debt portfolio is paying off. But there's another important reason why criticism from the government about debt levels doesn't hold water. We know that Labor wanted to spend more, $81 billion more. They constantly advanced bigger spending programs during the pandemic, including $6 billion in handouts to Australians who were already getting vaccinated. That was to get them to get vaccinated, but they were doing it anyway. Extensions of JobKeeper that weren't needed, and construction of quarantine facilities that would now be sitting empty. Labor went to the last election promising to make the budget bottom line worse. Too many ministers are looking to reward stakeholders who supported them at the election. So it remains to be seen whether this Treasurer has the experience and the strength to say no to colleagues, an important attribute of a good Treasurer. So the test for the new government is whether it improves the strong budget position it inherited or makes excuses to spend more and to tax more. My fear is that in the future years we'll look back on the strength of the current budget, and the current budget position as a lost opportunity. Now, if a government can't manage budgets, it can't deliver lower taxes. Indeed, it will inevitably have to find a way to raise taxes in time. Higher taxes kill aspiration, enterprise and opportunity. And some are arguing the lower taxes are not what we need in an inflationary environment. But longer-term tax reforms strengthen the capacity and the growth of the economy. Lower taxes encourage people to invest, to work hard, to innovate, to build businesses and to build careers. That's why over recent years, we delivered tax cuts to small businesses and households. It's why we got rid of the mining tax and the carbon tax. It's why we reduced company tax for small businesses and of course personal income tax for all Australians. It's why one of our first acts in opposition was to argue for a lower effective marginal tax rate for pensioners. And it's why we committed to a tax cap of 23.9% of GDP. We've always stood for lower taxes, and in opposition, we don't plan to walk away from this. Labor struggles to support lower taxes because the instinct is always to spend more. Their support for the stage 3 tax cuts is at best half-hearted, and it remains to be seen whether we'll see them through. The Treasurer said that they were unaffordable and unwise. I've little doubt he's considering tax increases for future budgets, reviving their taxes on superannuation, incomes, franking credits and capital gains, and we've heard talk on franking credits just in the last 48 hours. The Treasurer and Finance Minister have refused to rule out tax increases both in the Parliament and in the media, despite very persistent and direct questions. But we already know 3 areas where taxes are coming, albeit sneaky taxes that aren't recorded necessarily directly in the budget papers, but will be acutely felt by Australian businesses and households. The first is bracket creep, which in an inflationary environment will be very strong. Bracket creep is an insidious increase in tax rates when there is a progressive tax system, as we have for income and now also company tax. It saps incomes without being obvious, other than when households and it becomes obvious only when households and businesses can't make ends meet. The second hidden tax is the higher inflation I outlined earlier, whittling away hard-working Australians' purchasing power and savings, punishing thrift. It means that going forward, one of the most efficient ways to deliver stronger real wages will be to reduce inflation. The third sneaky tax is on energy-intensive industry through the overbuild of transmission lines and the tightening of the safeguard mechanism. Increased transmission line spending is passed through to customers. Labor's proposing a total spend of up to 80 billion, 20 billion from taxpayers, and on many projects that are not recommended by the market operator. One thing is clear, it will drive up prices. About that, there is no ambiguity. And while the details and Labor's changes to the safeguard mechanism are still unclear, it's clear that many energy-intensive companies in agribusiness, transport and mining will be hit. Already, pressure is building on Labor to remove protections for energy-intensive trade-exposed industries like our manufacturers, our miners and others. But we have seen in Europe the impact of putting virtue above common sense when it comes to these sectors. So the test for Labor when it comes to tax is, will they adopt our 23.9% tax cap, or will they allow sneaky or even explicit tax increases to sap the rewards to Australians from enterprise, effort and thrift? Now, over the longer term, a stronger economy, balanced budgets, lower taxes, robust real wage growth, quality public services are only achievable, as Tom pointed out up front, through strong productivity growth. Of course, in politics, productivity is always considered to be a dirty word as a proxy for job losses, but nothing could be further from the truth. Genuine productivity is the only pathway to prosperity. We shouldn't pretend that the productivity achievements of past decades are the right ones for now either. The much celebrated reforms of the 80s and 90s, which resulted from that environment I outlined earlier, focused on private sector gains, particularly in industry, mining and agriculture, but they have reached diminishing returns. The composition of the economy has changed dramatically, and so the productivity focus needs to change with it. Increasingly, this depends on productivity in services, particularly non-market services, as the Productivity Commission has recently pointed out. Non-market services or public services like health, aged care, disability, childcare and social assistance have become a much bigger part of the economy, and productivity in these sectors drives overall productivity. In fact, those sectors are now make up about 25% of employment, and they're pushing 30% of economic activity. So managing the growth in costs of public services while delivering strong customer outcomes is exactly what we focused on prior to the pandemic, but they need to be replicated. Those outcomes need to be replicated for many years to come. The new government has downgraded the expected productivity gains per year from 1.5% to 1.2% in their most recent outlook. We can only assume that they believe their own policies will slow economic growth and deteriorate the budget over the medium term. But it's crucial to challenge vested interests unaligned with the national interest if productivity is to be strong. Whether it's big data platforms or the unions, we will continue to challenge, as Liberals and Nationals, vested interests where those interests are not aligned with the national interest, particularly with respect to productivity. For Labor, the productivity and competition necessary to drive opportunity and realise aspiration for so many Australians has been and is likely to remain a blind spot. So the challenge for the new government is that many of the unions who backed them at the election are making demands that are often diametrically opposed to strong productivity gains. The test is the new government willing to challenge vested interests to drive strong productivity as we recover from the pandemic? Now, some might say that the four principles I've outlined here today should have been more evident during the pandemic. I would argue that prior to the pandemic, they were very much on display, and the recovery has been stunning, fast and effective. But as the next wave of challenges hits us, inflation and interest rates bucking decades of downward trends, core Liberal National Party values are more important, in my view, than ever. Productivity is more important than ever as we look to a longer-term pathway for balanced budgets, higher real wages and quality public services. And just as the pandemic itself required adaptation and response, so too does the current environment. We'll work closely with Labor if it stays close and true to these common sense principles in the national interest. We'll hold them to account if they don't. We'll hope for the best and plan for the worst. But whether Labor has a plan or not, we will continue to form our own plans and policies in the coming months and years ahead based on the principles I've laid out today. Australia deserves no less.
Thank you very much, Angus. You mentioned one of your priorities, of course, is to tackle inflation and higher interest rates. The conventional wisdom blames Ukraine crisis and extraordinarily loose monetary policy from the central banks for our inflation crisis. But what about the massive government spending programs that the last coalition government implemented, fully backed by Labor, of course? Didn't they also contribute to higher inflation?
Well, my point here, Tom, is that we have to get the budget back into a strong position. It was always an imperative. Look, the goal was to be in a position where we had, you might remember this discussion about the V-shaped recovery. You get an economy back on top again, and then your budget comes back into a strong position. The irony is that's exactly what's happened, and that is exactly what is needed. The worst thing that could happen now, having got into a position where our economy is extremely strong, arguably too strong, but certainly extremely strong, and the budget is extremely strong. The worst thing that could happen now is that windfall that Labor describes is spent. And that's exactly what we don't need to see.
Do you accept now that the government spending as a share of GDP on health and education, leaving aside COVID spending, that increased during the coalition period in government?
Well, as a percent of GDP, we actually saw government spending being contained. I mean, this is an important point. Matthias Cormann makes this point all the time, that the crucial thing to do on the spending side is to have spending growing more slowly than the overall economy. And that's exactly what happened in the lead up to 2019. Now, it's true, during the pandemic, there was additional spending, and I made the comment in the speech, there'll be debates for years to come about what of that was more necessary than other parts, isn't it? And that's all a reasonable debate. What matters now is not that. What matters now is that we are getting budgets back into shape and keeping them in shape.
Okay,
and that is the key.
My economics colleague, Robert Carling, who's been at CIS for 15 years, he used to be the Treasury at both Commonwealth and State and World Bank and the IMF. He wrote recently in the Financial Review that the program-specific risks of higher spending in the fast-growing areas of NDIS, Gonski, public school, public hospitals, aged care, childcare, and now defence, that represents the largest threats to budget repair. Indeed, this is Robert Carling's point, they account for about half the estimated total increase in federal spending over the 10 years from 2013 to 2014. So clearly these massive Labor spending monuments and defence need to be cut, right?
Well, no, let's think about it this way, right? The important point here is, as I said in my speech, is that you've got public service demand at a level that we've never seen before. That's understandable. We're wealthier than we were in the 70s and 80s, so you would expect some of that. The question is, how do you deliver it whilst keeping low taxes, or having even lower taxes, which is what our policy always was, and having balanced budgets? And there is only one way you're going to be able to do that, and that's productivity. And that was my point about productivity, that the Productivity Commission is making what I think is a very strong point, which is that productivity focus now needs to move to what they call non-market services. That's public services, effectively. And that is the only way through this challenge.
How do you educate the public about fiscal restraint when it's clearly politically difficult to cut spending in sensitive areas? I mean, there is no such thing as a magic money tree, correct?
Yeah, but let's remember this. If you've got an economy growing at 3% and spending growing at 2%, right, it is incredible how quickly, because of the effect of compounding, that strengthens your budget position. That's exactly what we saw when Matthias was finance minister in the lead up to 2019. That's exactly what we saw. That's what you have to do. Now, the only way to achieve that is to make sure every dollar of taxpayer money is being spent extremely well, extremely effectively, and is getting bang for buck, which is productivity. That's what it is, Tom. And it's why in your introduction, rightly, you pointed out how important this was. But what's changed about it, lots of people like to talk about the wonderful reforms of the 70s and 80s, and there were many wonderful reforms that happened then into the 90s with Howard, and he drove a whole series as well. So they were wonderful. But what's changed is the economy. And so it is now about saying, well, look, we do need to provide better education for our kids. We do need to provide a high-quality health system. But we need to do it in a way where we're getting absolute bang for our buck. And I think that is absolutely achievable.
The Aussie dollar crisis in the mid-1980s prompted the economic reform agenda. You had Paul Keating warning that we would become a banana republic if we do not open up the Australian economy to global forces. We are vulnerable to economic storms. We did weather the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. China, in many respects, saved us. But just say in the event of an accident of history, there's a clash over Taiwan, the Ukraine crisis continues throughout the northern winter, the Eurozone declines, the British pound's taking a pounding. How vulnerable is Australia if we don't put in place those kind of productivity-enhancing reforms?
Well, they're longer term. I mean, in the shorter term, I think there are very real risks in responding the wrong way to rising inflation and interest rates. Yeah. That's the threat. And the real issue here is that you're not going to beat inflation and rising interest rates by throwing lots of money at all sorts of things. Yes, targeted investment on the supply side of the economy, sure. But at the end of the day, traditional demand-driven government stimulus is not going to solve the problem, Tom. And that's the real challenge governments face. It's actually also the real challenge governments faced back in the 70s and 80s when we saw an earlier variant of what we're seeing today. And so this is why this budget is so crucial. If this budget looks for excuses to spend money at what the Treasurer has called a $50 billion windfall, if he wants to blow all that, then the constituency that will pay the price is anyone with a mortgage. That's the truth, because the Reserve Bank will have to raise interest rates more than will otherwise be the case. And that's the fear I have, that we now have to explain the connection between sensible government policy and interest rates. It's not just about the Reserve Bank, it's also about the government. And there's a real test for Labor in this. Already they're saying, oh, well, it's a $50 billion windfall, but it's all going to disappear. Well, it will all disappear if they spend it.
Okay, Angus, let's take questions from the audience. My first question goes to Simon Cowan, who runs our research program. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Shadow Treasurer. You said in your speech that Labor was only half-hearted committed to the stage 3 tax cuts. I would push back on that and say I'm not sure the coalition's any more committed than Labor was, given that they announced those tax cuts 6 years ago and that the stage 3 implementation, which was the bulk of the reform part of the project, was 4 years after stage 2 was completed. So can you then say that the coalition who announced these tax cuts back in 2017 for implementation in 2024 is fully committed to stage 3?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, and the irony is, Simon, if I look at those reforms now, partly by good luck, arguably partly by good management, the timing looks perfect. Why? Because the job now in the next little while is to get this inflation beast under control, and then on the back of that, get productivity really firing. And a critical way to do that is to have lower taxes. We know lower taxes drives activity. It drives incentives. I mean, part of what we're trying to do with those stage 3 tax cuts is get rid of the seeping impact of bracket creep. And as you know, I think the timing on this is really good. And we stand for lower taxes, and we will continue to stand for lower taxes. I certainly. You can see, I think, that the strength of my commitment to continue down that path.
Gary Sturgis, former senior advisor to Premier Nick Reiner.
Angus, we do, back in that period you're talking about, there was a significant public sector productivity reform initiative, corporatisation and commercialisation of government business enterprises. Here in New South Wales, good data on that.
Yes.
A threefold improvement in labour productivity over a 10-year period.
Yes.
I don't see any reason why that same kind of productivity can't come out of the human services.
Yes.
That, as you rightly say, is an important part of what as a wealthier country we now demand. What model, what framework are you thinking about to deliver that kind of productivity gain from, the sort of more, the human services part of the public service economy?
Yeah, no, great question, Gary. And of course, you are absolutely the right person to be asking that question, because I think, I'd pay tribute to the extraordinary work you've done in this area over many, many years, including with the New South Wales government, who I think have done some remarkable work in this area. You only have to look at Services in New South Wales to see the quality of what they've done there, which engaging with a government website where you actually quite enjoy it is a remarkable thing, isn't it? It is a remarkable thing, but it's a good example of how you can get this stuff right. And make a real difference. Now, the digital piece there's no question that's an important part of it. Technology and the role that technology can play in these service areas, I think, is enormous. I was part at McKinsey and beyond of a generation that looked at productivity in the private sector. My first job in McKinsey was finding productivity in a steel mill. That's what it was in the 80s and 90s. And the results were stunning. Absolutely stunning. The reason we still have a steel mill at Port Kembla is because of work done in that time period. And it is in incredible health, actually. When you go down there, it's in really good shape because we found really strong productivity gains. It was good, ultimately, for everyone. The people in that location, the workers, the shareholders, they all gained. So we have to find that same kind of mojo when it comes to what you describe as human services. I think the digital piece, the technology piece is absolutely central. There's also, the model around it, as you rightly say. All of these things, and they're evolving, and we've made a number of reforms when we were in government in this area. It also involves state governments. There's no question. You can't get there without state governments being part of that. But if we want to have higher real wages, at the same time as balanced budgets, low taxes, this is ultimately in the longer term what we have to do. And I would commend to everybody the work that's being done by the Productivity Commission, which we commissioned, the Josh Commission, when we were in government. I think they are doing an excellent piece of work. It's still at the interim stage, but I think this has the potential to really open up some important opportunities.
Peter Tulip, former economist at the RBA and the Federal Reserve, who's now our chief economist here at CIS. Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor. I thought that was a really informative and thoughtful speech, so thanks a lot for that. I'd like to ask about housing policy, which was one of the most prominent issues in the recent election campaign. Earlier this year, a parliamentary inquiry chaired by Jason Walensky said that the big problem with housing is supply restrictions, in particular zoning and planning restrictions, and the federal government doesn't have direct responsibility for that, but can encourage reform through incentive payments. So Jason lost his seat in the recent federal election. So it's a two-barreled question. Partly is, has Parliament lost its main voice for housing affordability? And related to that, is the Liberal Party committed to the Walensky committee agenda?
Yep. No, it's a great question, Peter. And Jason and I have had this discussion on a number of occasions. There's no doubt in inflationary pressures, housing is right up there, the cost of housing. And we've seen that even in just sort of the cost of renovations, for instance, coming through in the last little while. But more broadly on housing, there's no doubt there is a cost issue, and the supply side is the hardest piece for a federal government to influence, but in many ways the most important piece as well. Ultimately, you can't do that without state governments. It's one of these difficult areas where it really does cross state boundaries. And I think there is an important role for government to play. I mean, if you look what we did with the Western Sydney City deal, which I led as the city's minister at the time, a big part of that was just getting more housing and jobs out in Western Sydney to deal with some of these supply pressures. So there is and incentives were an important part of that. That continues to need to be the focus. We'll say much more about this, I have no doubt. Michael Suker, one of my colleagues, is very passionate about it. As you may well know, just as Jason is, and I can assure you that Jason has not gone quiet on this issue. He's still talking about it.
Yeah, I mentioned Robert Carling.
You spoke about lower taxes and balanced budgets, and we had a stunning announcement from the UK last week about lower taxes by the new Truss government. But that's in the context of raging inflation in the UK and public debt deficits and public debt levels that make us look good. So do you think that that approach is completely wrong, or is there something in it?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, Robert, and I know you've been very strong on thinking about these fiscal policy issues for a long time, and I pay tribute to the work you've done. The circumstances in the UK are very different to here. I mean, we actually have a much stronger underlying economy. Inflation there is significantly higher, as you suggested, and so the circumstances are different. So I'd rather focus on Australia than the UK. I mean, I do think we have to get that longer term productivity agenda right, and I think taxes are a really crucial part of that. At the same time, we need to deal with this inflation beast we have, and we have to get it back into the cage. And getting that balance right is going to be the challenge for every government. I think it's why we are so strong on ensuring that Labor doesn't spend away the huge bounty it's got that you saw on those charts I put up. The UK will have to deal with its own circumstances, and we're all watching very closely because I think there's some interesting learnings that will come out of what they're doing. But they're certainly rolling. They're certainly going hard on it, and as you will, I'm sure I'll be interested to see how it goes over the next little while, and I wish them the best because the UK, great economy, great country, we want to see them succeed.
This is what the Wall Street Journal, they just put out an editorial on the UK crisis. There are risks all around, but don't underestimate the risks of the stagflationary status quo. Britain is on track to be the worst performing major economy next year, and the pound was sinking well before the Chancellor announced his plan late last week. Margaret Thatcher used to say, there is no alternative. Now there's no alternative to changing course after the policy failures of recent years. Voters can hope for a frank debate about which alternative they should choose. So there's a great debate taking place right now in Great Britain about fiscal policy and economic policy generally between the trusts, free marketeers, if you like, and the more left-leaning Labor opposition. Alan Young.
Thanks, Angus. It was a great speech. I thought it played really well to the room. But most Australians have become accustomed to government money fixing problems. And so my question for you is, how can you win an election by telling Australians they've got to bear some pain because balanced budgets are important?
Yeah, but here's what's changed. If a government is going to spend a lot of money, there is a very distinct group of people out there who are going to pay the price. And they are in my electorate. If you go to Spring Farm or Elderslie, between Camden and Campbelltown, new mortgage-built areas, new houses being built every day, and they'll pay 700,000, 800,000, 900,000 or more for their house with a very high loan-to-value ratio. If the government wants to keep spending money, then the Reserve Bank will have to raise interest rates, and that group will pay the price. Now, they are an aspirational group, lots of tradies, nurses, teachers, they're having a real go, they've bought their home, they're raising a family, and that group are going to pay the price for bad policy. We haven't seen a situation like this for a long, long time, where there is a very distinct group of people who are going to pay the price for a government that can't control its spending. And that's the situation we're now facing. It's why, I'm saying every day, so the budget is surprisingly strong. I've never seen a treasurer so unhappy that he'd found $50 billion. And that's $50 billion for the last financial year, let alone how much he's got for this year and future years. Right? Yeah, he'll try to pretend it's all going to go away. But the truth is, it's a very strong position. The question now is not whether he's got a strong position. He has. The question is he going to spend it all? And there's a long queue of people asking for the money. And if he does spend it all, then the truth is those people in Elderslie, in Spring Farm, and elsewhere, right across the mortgage belt parts of our country, are going to pay a very, very hefty price. And so politically, this is a very it's a very real issue. I think it's very different from what we've faced in recent years.
Next question, Janet Barlow.
You mentioned the rollout of the transmission lines, presumably to roll out more wind turbines and solar panels. Could you comment on the mandate to preference wind and solar in the grid? How long will that last? And also, what are the total annual subsidies for wind, solar, renewable energy? And the Liberal Party has been very anti-drilling for gas in New South Wales, increasing the supply of gas coming out of the ground. Could you comment?
Yeah, so I'm not going to comment on Labor's policies on those areas because I don't know what they all are and where they're going to end up. And that's part of the point I made in the speech. What I will say is that we don't have cost benefits done on $80 billion worth of transmission projects, but that's what the government is claiming it's going to do. So I can't answer your question as to how they're all going to be used. All I know is there's a lot of money there to do it. And ultimately, the way transmission line investments work is consumers pay for it. That's how it works. It just gets passed through to the consumer. So we should all be worried about whether that money is just going to be another tax on our energy system. And I'll leave it for Labor to describe what subsidies they're going to have in the coming years. I don't know. I mean, that's a question for them. On your latter question on gas, look. If there's one thing that's become really apparent in the last little while, it's that gas is actually crucial to a successful transition. I mean, I always thought that was a pretty obvious point. But the Europeans are paying the price for realising that they do need the gas, but for deciding that they could get it from Russia, and they're paying a very heavy toll for that. You have to have a strong gas supply to get through what we've got to get through in the coming years. It is very clear. That's why when we were in government, we did back additional gas production at Santos and Narrabri. We pushed that very hard. We got the New South Wales government to move ahead with that, which was very good. The Beetaloo Basin, I think, one of the great basins, great prospectivity for gas there. And the truth is that if you have gas as part of the mix, you can get that balance right between sustainability, affordability and reliability. But without gas, as we're seeing in Europe and in Asia right now, it's extremely difficult.
Angus, on climate and energy policy, let's get your reaction to something that Alexander Downer, the former, the longest-serving coalition foreign minister who writes for the Financial Review, this is what he said recently, quote, "How is it cheaper to have energy that has to be subsidised? If it has to be subsidised by definition, it must be more expensive. And the subsidies have to be paid for. If they're not paid for through higher taxes, then they will be paid for through increased borrowing. The increased expenditure and borrowing," Downer concludes, "will contribute to increased inflation and increased interest rates." Angus Taylor.
Yeah, well, look, the truth of the matter is that if you want to bring down emissions without imposing costs on Australians and people all around the world, and particularly the people who can least afford it, because they're the ones who pay a higher proportion of their income in energy costs, then reducing the cost of low emissions technologies is always going to be the fastest way to do it. Reducing the underlying costs, the real costs. So whether that's in solar, where we've seen this 12% a year reduction in the costs for over 40 years. I mean, remarkable. Much of that driven by Australia, right? So this is a great success story. We should be proud of this. This is. I use solar pumps and solar on my farm, and it's just absolutely brilliant, the technology and the way it's advanced over time. That way, with technology advance, you can do this without imposing taxes and costs on people. And our policy has always been about driving the broadest range of technologies. One of the technologies we have to have a sensible discussion about now in this country is nuclear. It's an important part of it.
Well, I mean, the expense involved with nuclear, though.
Well, I could say exactly the same about solar 40 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago even. And I could say the same about hydrogen now. I mean, the thing is, these costs can come down if governments direct efforts, R&D in particular, is where, which is often, at least partly, publicly funded. So there is a role for government to play on that side of things. And I think those costs can come down. I think costs on a whole range of technologies can come down, and that's the job now to achieve. And that way, people pick these technologies because they work for them, not because they're told to.
Second last question, John Connor.
Angus, just on another topic, the small and medium businesses in this country constitute the majority of our private economy.
Yep.
They also constitute the most natural constituency for the coalition. In the light of that, what I find particularly strange is the way in which the coalition has allowed the development of a tax system and administration that is heavily biased against small and medium business. Much of the legislation has been introduced under the coalition governments. And I wondered whether, given the leisure time that's afforded by being in opposition, it's contemplated that there will in fact be a study divorced from the seductions of the tax department and the Treasury into how in fact private small business, medium business is being impacted by our tax system and its administration. Because quite frankly, if you want to increase productivity, that's a pretty easy place to start.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And look, our sympathy for small businesses as a coalition, I think, is very strong. And partly that's because so many of us have worked in small business over the course of our careers, and that's not true of the other side of politics, and that will remain. So, is there work to be done by getting rid of unnecessary red tape, including in the tax system on small businesses? I think that's always an opportunity in opposition, as you rightly point out, to really stand back and reflect. And there's no doubt that right now we're spending a lot of time listening to small businesses, listening to the issues they're raising. This is one of them. There's no question about it. And so I think this is an area where we'll continue to listen very hard and look for opportunities to try and improve the situation. Because as a small business person, if you're spending an undue proportion of your time on administration, That's time you're not spending with your customers, your employees, and on your business, and that hurts. I've seen it, I've known it, I've felt it, so it's an area we need to focus on.
Final question, David Gallagher.
A couple of things. The importance of structural reform and taxation, and that's something that's been debated for 15 years by different sides of politics. Can I also add to the fact there that in order to implement a lot of the taxation reform that we need, we actually need political reform because, for example, Abbott's government was unable to get through the Senate, and so those numbers would have looked a lot better if they had been passed. So how do we, first of all, improve the structural taxation system through politics? The second one is, which I think is really interesting, is sort of federal-state relations. You've got the Queensland government now looking to impose higher taxes on other people in other states who have investment properties in Queensland.
Yep.
Can you comment a bit about that in terms of the distortions that might occur federal-state?
Look, the broader issue, in my view, should start with we just want to ultimately see lower taxes wherever we can achieve it. I mean, that has to be our starting point. I mean, there are wonderful debates about which tax should be lower and which one shouldn't. But if our starting point is we want to see lower taxes, it gets us, to a point where we're driving economic growth, we're driving prosperity, we're encouraging activity, and we are looking for sensible ways to deliver public services without always having to throw more money at it. Right? So that's always got to be our starting point. Then I think there's a reasonable and sensible debate about which taxes are the ones that are having the biggest impact on the economy, that are slowing things down, and I think that's a very reasonable debate, and we'll no doubt engage in that in the future. I mean, I think we were absolutely right to make the call that we needed to see lower personal income tax rates. They are high by global standards here, and that's why we remain absolutely committed to the stage 3 tax cuts.
Angus, being in opposition can be a lonely experience, particularly so soon after the loss of government. But I think it's fair to say this morning you've given heart to many classical liberals and fiscal conservatives and free marketeers alike. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Angus Taylor. Thank you. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.